because we've got you as well, an international relations scholar, and talking about what's happening in the Middle East. We've had this conversation last night, and we're probably going to have it tomorrow night as well. I'm interested in a couple of things about the government committing 6 people to the region to help in the fight against the Houthi, and they are. It's obviously a symbolic gesture, because what are 6 people going to do? It can't be anything more than symbolic. But what does it symbolize? And what do you think about the government making this stand to send these 6 service people across?
Well, I think the first thing we have to establish is the government insists there is no linkage between the unceasing or unrelenting Israeli and American-backed military offensive or military assault on Gaza and the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. Mm-hmm. And I think that claim, there's no connection, has led the government to, on that basis, to further claim that the Houthi attacks have come out of the blue, it's piracy, and that we have a long-standing commitment to maritime security in the Red Sea, and therefore we're simply acting in a way which is consistent with past New Zealand governments, and we are contributing to trying to uphold the rule of law in the Red Sea. I'm skeptical about that explanation, because it seems to me the government, one thing we should be quite clear about is the government seems to be contradicting its own policy.
Yeah.
On the 27th of October and on the 13th of December, New Zealand, on the 27th of October, it voted in the General Assembly. It was the only member of the Five Eyes to do so, for an immediate humanitarian truce. Then it co-sponsored a resolution on the 13th of December, which demanded an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. So, and guess who opposed that? The United States and the United Kingdom. So we now find ourselves in a position where, despite indicating our strong desire for an immediate ceasefire, we are backing countries which have, if you like, defied New Zealand's diplomatic wishes and continued to support Israel in its in its military campaign in Gaza, which has killed close to 25,000 Palestinians and created what can only be described as a humanitarian catastrophe. About 70% of the civilians killed are women and children, more than 10,000 Palestinian children. So we're talking about large numbers of civilians who had nothing to do with the appalling terrorist attacks that Israel experienced on the 7th of October. So most people, it looks like disproportionate offensive. So we're in a situation now where we seem to be contradicting our own early stance in demanding a ceasefire. And one of the reasons many countries, including New Zealand, wanted an early ceasefire, because apart from the humanitarian consideration, there was a strategic consideration that this terrible conflict in Gaza could spread to the region. And now, and that's why the United States, immediately after it started its unconditional support for Israel after the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October, that's why it immediately deployed 2 warships to the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. So, you know, I don't understand why the government is now claiming the situation in Gaza has little to do with the situation in the Red Sea. I think for most international observers, including the 160 states which voted for an immediate ceasefire in the General Assembly, the Houthis, and it's not trying to condone it, what the Houthis are doing is probably is unacceptable. They are using missiles and offensive weaponry against civilian shipping, which is perceived to be linked to Israel. they're doing that because the UN Security Council, which is the primary institution for maintaining peace and security, has been hamstrung by the 3 vetoes from the United States. And the world has been watching almost from an armchair as Israel implements its intensive bombardment and its ground offensive, which has killed, as we said before, large numbers of Palestinian civilians. And I think that there was always the prospect that other parties in the region would act to further their interests. Iran and its axis of resistance, including the Houthis, but also the Hezbollah in Lebanon. We have to take into account that, yes, they may be genuinely concerned about the Palestinians, but they will also be happy to, in a sense, exploit the plight of the Palestinians to project the interests of a regional actor like Iran. Why? Because, as we know, the conflict in the Middle East is not just between Israel and its Arab neighbors, but also between a fault line in Islam between Shia and Sunni. And, for example, we saw the conflict in Yemen between the Houthis, which are Shia and supported by Iran, and the Sunni coalition government, 65, which represents about 65% in ethnicity terms of the population, which is supported by Saudi Arabia. So, in a sense, there was this inability to bring a ceasefire to Gaza quickly was always full of the prospect of the conflict spreading. And the Houthis have made it quite clear that they have started attacking or targeting civilian merchant shipping or civilian commercial shipping in order to try to force a ceasefire. They said they will stop all such activity as soon as there is a ceasefire. So I'm not saying we should embrace a ceasefire because of what the Houthis are doing. I'm saying that we should immediately move to a ceasefire because it's the right thing to do, diplomatically, morally, and legally. You know, one thing I found very interesting about the government's response is they said, we're just simply trying to do what all previous New Zealand governments, which is uphold the rule of law in the Red Sea. Well, that's compartmentalizing things a bit, isn't it? Because what about the rule of law in Gaza, where both Hamas and Israel have basically trashed humanitarian law? And we need the rule of, if we're going to be consistent about this, and I think most Kiwis across the political divide believe in a fair go, but if we're going to uphold the rule of law internationally, we can't create an artificial distinction between the situation in the Red Sea, where the rule of law is being undermined, and Gaza, where it's also being blatantly undermined.
Hey, Robert, if you've got just one more second, we've got a young man in our green room right now, a great friend of the show, and I know he wanted to talk about this, so he may have a question for you.
Sure.
People may not have met this man before, but his name is Chewy, and he's just back from the United States of America, and he's been popping in and out of the thing all night, and I've been seeing you, Chewy. I don't know if you got my text messages, but if you've got a second to go, Robert, Chewy was keen to talk about this. So Chewy, welcome. Let's talk about where you've been, what you've been doing shortly. But have you got anything you want to ask Robert about the situation with the Houthi?
I don't know if I directly have a question about it, but what has struck me about this, right, is all the major players, Britain and the US, seem to have jumped on these guys as almost a distraction. That they can't, for whatever reason, influence what's going on in Palestine at the moment. But here is a really clear-cut Islamic bad guys attacking civilian shipping, and we can do something with that. We can be seen to be springing into action in ways that we just haven't, in a way of preventing what's happening in Palestine, or In the case of Ukraine, sort of, yeah, we're helping, but not really helping. Is this just a case of it being picking low-hanging fruit?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I do think the Biden administration is under enormous pressure. There's been very worrying signs. There's been the abandoned Biden movement going on amongst young Muslims in the United States.
Yeah.
And there's been, all polling evidence suggests, and this is unprecedented, for the first time, polls are suggesting that many people are beginning to favour the Palestinian side of the long-running argument with Israel. So, in a sense, by putting a lot of emphasis on, if you like, deterring the Houthis, and that, by the way, those attempts at a deterrence don't seem to be working so far.
Yeah.
The Houthis seem to be relishing the confrontation with the UK and the US. And that's worrying, because one thing that Pat and I were just discussing was the New Zealand dispatch of 6 NZDF personnel. And one thing that government owes to the people of this country is to say what the political objective of dispatching those forces are.
Because it does send a clear message to the world that New Zealand is on board with Israel.
Well, they need to be absolutely clear.
Yeah.
I mean, there was the great strategist, Karl von Clausewitz, and he said, no one but a fool enters a conflict without defining the political objective of participating in the conflict. In other words, you can't simply sign up for something where you don't know where it's going. At the moment, the situation in the Red Sea, there's no evidence that the UK and the US are deterring the Houthis and their Iranian backers. But you could be right, Chewy, that the Americans have seized upon this to try to regain a bit more international support. I think it's very difficult for the United States, because they seem to have an absolute blind spot with regard to the Netanyahu government. I mean, Mr. Netanyahu is defying the Americans in many areas. The Israeli government has shown no ability to distinguish between civilian and military casualties, and doesn't seem to be doing much to try to rectify that problem. In addition, Mr. Netanyahu has been quite adamant and proud of the fact that he has no intention of ever, while he's in power, of allowing a Palestinian state. He gave an extraordinary interview on the 16th and 17th of December last year, where he said he took great pride in playing a major role in denying the Palestinian state for the last 30 years, and he will continue to do that in the future. And of course, he, once again, in the last few days, has reiterated this. Now, the official position of the United States backing Israel against Hamas for the day after, as it's called, once they've defeated Hamas, is to create a two-state solution. So America finds itself in an extraordinary situation where it's continuing to arm an ally which has no intention of responding to America's political preferences when the conflict is over. They're quite happy to accept American military support, but not American political prescriptions. So it is an extraordinary situation. Yes, maybe the Red Sea is a distraction. I don't think, however, those who claim there is no connection between the Gaza conflict and the Red Sea will win the argument. I think in the eyes of most people, it's quite clear what is the central dynamic driving tension in the region. It is the unrelenting bombardment of Gaza.
Hey, Robert, thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to let you go. I just want to say one other thing, and then we're not asking you another question, though, so consider this wrapped now. But the one thing I thought about tonight was I was listening to Jeffrey Miller. I think he was on One News. And Jeffrey Miller, who was a geopolitical analyst, for people who don't know him, I've actually asked him to come on tomorrow night, talked about this event of sending the 6 armed service people may end up costing us our independence, and the world sees New Zealand as an independent sort of, you know, if you think back to the no nukes, or and I just thought about it afterwards. It got me quite angry, actually, because I thought, how dare this government, how dare the Prime Minister put at threat this thing that New Zealand has built up of independence for so long, for so many years, across so many governments, and then one decision by a new government could put all of that to sea. And I just thought, how dare they? That if this ends up happening, this will be the worst decision New Zealand's made for New Zealand on a world map. It's just what I thought.
No, I think it's a really valid observation by Jeffrey. And the thing that really strikes me, that there's been a huge disconnect between the political parties in this country and I think the average person on the street, so to speak, on this issue. I mean, many Kiwis, I said this before to Pat, across the political divide have a sense of fairness. And I think many people felt horrified that our political representatives, first of all, there was the excuse of the transition in early October.
Yeah.
And then there was the protracted negotiations. And then we had a new government. And the government seemed to be doing the right thing in the UN General Assembly, but not really speaking up. And I think many people overseas have been very disappointed by the fact this is the country that defied a superpower over non-nuclear security. And this was the country under Helen Clark which said no to the US's illegal invasion of Iraq. We refused to participate in it. Have we spoken up at the level of the leadership of this country on behalf of the Palestinians who've been let down by the international community because the UN Security Council, which whose job is to protect and maintain international peace, have been hamstrung by the veto? In other words, there was a vacuum and we remained silent. And silence is complicity. That's how it will be seen by Palestinians. And then I think Jeffrey's right. This will be seen, I think. We can't control the narrative internationally or the perceptions, but there's a real risk, as Jeffrey suggests, that we'll be seen as paying lip service to having independent foreign policy, but essentially returning to the Anglosphere.
Professor Robert Patman, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. I always apologise at the end of these chats because we always go far longer than we ever agree to. And you're on holiday, but thank you for joining us. Everyone in the chat loves you.
Great to speak to you guys.
Very keen to have you on board. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hey, Chewy.
Hey, mate. How's it going?
Good. I just want to say one thing. Obviously, we all want to know about you and your trip and stuff, but the one thing I thought as Robert was speaking to them, talking about the no nukes and the Helen Clark. There's a common thread. There's a common thread about governing bodies of this country during those things that set us up to be this international, shining light on a hill. And one of them was David Lange and a Labour government, and one of them was Helen Clark and a Labour government. Now we have our hairless leader coming on board, and according to at least one geopolitical analyst, putting all of that at threat by making a symbolic gesture that is going to, that allows the world to look at us and go, oh, they're on Israel's side.
I said many choice words, like the good top shelf words.
Ooh.
When I read that story,
yeah,
about Luxon committing us to this, not able to make a definitive comment that what Israel is doing wrong, really walking that line of weasel words and that sort of thing. And then I saw the press conference with him and Winston being asked questions by the press, and he just literally hot potatoed the question to Winston, and Winston did what Winston does and goes on the attack rather than giving us a straight answer of like, do we not think of a Palestinian two-state solution? What's going on? Where has this come from? What possible benefit does New Zealand get from contributing Defence Force personnel to this? We're not required. We're not needed. It paints us into a corner.
Yeah, but Christopher Luxon's evangelical friends will be happy that we're there for Israel. We talk. Remember how much the National Party were concerned about conflicts of interest when it came to the Labour Party. How about Israel and a prime minister who was an evangelical Christian, and evangelical Christians pledged their undying support? How about a conflict of interest there?